America often tells the story of slavery as if it were one long nightmare endured in silence. As if millions of people lived and died without ever fighting back. As if resistance came only in whispers, prayers, or the quiet hope that someday, somehow, freedom would arrive on its own. But that version of history isn't just incomplete, it's misleading. Because the truth is far louder, far bolder, and far more human than we've been taught. This is the hidden record of rebellions, uprisings, escapes, sabotage, and courage that unfolded in the shadows of the American South. These are the stories of enslaved people who refused to accept bondage as their fate. People who strategized, organized, resisted, and dreamed fiercely of freedom. Their names were whispered then. And today, we speak them out loud. Our story begins not in a battlefield, but in the heat of a blacksmith's forge, in the late 1700s, in Virginia. Imagine a young enslaved man named Gabriel, tall and strong, his hands covered in soot. Sparks lighting up his face as he pounds molten metal into shape. His master thinks he's simply working. But what Gabriel is really doing is absorbing the world. He listens to political arguments the way someone else might study an instruction manual. He learns about the American Revolution, the French Revolution, about words like liberty, equality, justice. He recognizes the hypocrisy of a nation shouting freedom while building its wealth on chains. And slowly, steadily, he decides that if freedom won't be given, it has to be taken. Gabriel begins to gather people, quietly, carefully. Men who were tired of being whipped, rented out, sold away from their families. Men who were educated, skilled, disciplined, and determined. They weren't looking to burn the world down, they wanted something simple, a chance to live as human beings. Together, they formed a plan so bold it sounds like a movie script: march into Richmond, take control of the armory, hold the governor hostage, and demand change. And this wasn't blind rage. Gabriel coordinated teams, assigned responsibilities, and created a chain of communication. He moved like a field commander, not a desperate man. But the night chosen for the uprising brought something no one expected, a violent storm that transformed dirt roads into rivers and wooden bridges into drifting wreckage. The rebels tried to push through the rain, but nature itself slowed them down, just long enough for fear to seep into someone's heart. Just long enough for betrayal to crack open the door. Someone talked, and within hours, the plan was exposed. The Virginia authorities hunted down conspirators one by one. Gabriel tried to escape by boat, but was caught, chained, and sentenced to death. They expected him to beg, to break, to confess. Instead, he stood firm, refusing to name a single person involved. On the day he died, he walked to the gallows proud and silent. He left behind no written words, no last letter, only the memory of a man who believed freedom was worth everything. Even his life. But if the authorities thought killing Gabriel would kill the idea of rebellion, they were wrong. Because resistance doesn't die with one person, it travels. And sometimes, it travels into the deepest swamps of the South, where enslaved people who escaped plantations built entire hidden worlds. These communities were called Maroon settlements, secret villages carved into mud, trees, and shadows. To outsiders, the swamps were nightmares, thick with snakes, insects, and fog. But to the people who lived there, they were sanctuary. They built cabins, planted crops, raised families, and created a life that defied every law and expectation. Slave catchers avoided these swamps. Dogs lost the scent. Soldiers got stuck waist deep in black water. The Maroons knew the land like it knew them. And from those hidden villages came a different kind of rebellion, one built on survival, independence, and defiance. When patrols tried to destroy one of these communities, the Maroons didn't run, they fought. And after fighting back, they went further, launching nighttime raids on plantations, freeing people, burning supplies, and disrupting the system in a way that rattled slaveholders to their core. Plantation owners used to call them ghosts, because they'd strike fast then melt into the fog before anyone could even load a gun. Authorities tried draining swamps, setting traps, offering rewards, sending more patrols, nothing worked. Many Maroon communities survived for decades. Some were never discovered at all. They didn't need victory in a grand battle, their very existence was resistance. But perhaps the largest and most organized uprising of all unfolded in Louisiana in 1811, An event so huge and so powerful that it should be taught in every American classroom, but somehow, almost no one hears about it. This was the German Coast Uprising, led by Charles Deslondes, a man whose courage matched his vision. Charles wasn't just another figure in history, he was a strategist. A leader, a person who understood that freedom required both heart and discipline. He gathered hundreds of enslaved people from plantations stretching miles along the Mississippi River. Together, they marched toward New Orleans in formation, carrying makeshift weapons, beating drums, waving flags, and moving like an army. Not a mob, an army. Imagine the fear that rippled through the slave-holding elite. Their worst nightmare wasn't that enslaved people might run, it was that they might unite. And here they were, hundreds strong, marching with purpose. The authorities panicked. Militias scrambled. Planters armed themselves. Federal troops were called in. The rebellion lasted only 2 days, but those 2 days shook the region to its bones. While the uprising was eventually crushed with brutal retaliation, the message rang out loud and clear: enslaved people were not passive. They never were. They were thinkers, fighters, dreamers, and revolutionaries. These uprisings were not isolated events. They were part of a larger pattern, a pattern of resistance that stretched across every plantation, every region, every generation. Resistance didn't always look like battles or marches. Sometimes it was quiet sabotage, tools broken by accident, work slowed to a crawl, crops mysteriously failing. Sometimes it was poison slipped into the food of an abusive master. Sometimes it was music encoded with messages about escape. Sometimes it was literacy learned in secret or maps carved into memory. Sometimes it was women who hid their children, men who taught each other skills, elders who preserved languages and prayers. Every act, big or small, was a refusal to surrender humanity. And yet, when we talk about American history today, these acts rarely make the textbooks. They don't appear in the polished museum exhibits or the clean timelines. They've been tucked away, softened, or erased because they challenge a narrative that some people preferred, the narrative that enslaved people were helpless, voiceless, or somehow accepting of their condition. But that history is false. The real history, the one that lived in whispers and fire, is a history of defiance, of courage, of brilliant, strategic rebellion. And the more we uncover these stories, the more clearly we see that the fight for freedom in America didn't begin with the Civil War. It began the moment the first person resisted the first chain. Take, for example, the networks of escape that sprouted long before the Underground Railroad became famous. Enslaved people used stars, rivers, and the whispers of others to find their way north. They traveled at night, hid in attics, barns, and swamps. Some dressed as sailors. Some disguised themselves as white men or white women. One couple famously escaped by having the wife, who was light-skinned, pretend to be an injured white gentleman, while her husband acted as her servant. They boarded trains, stayed in hotels, and passed through checkpoints with unbelievable audacity. And they made it. Stories like this weren't rare. They were just hidden. And then there were people who resisted from within the system, enslaved men and women who negotiated, manipulated, gathered information, and used every ounce of wit and resilience to protect others. People who learned the value of patience and timing. People who took enormous risks not because they wanted glory, but because they wanted justice. In South Carolina, there were rumors of another planned uprising, a movement that never fully ignited but traveled in whispers. An enslaved man named Denmark Vesey, who had once purchased his freedom after winning the lottery, became a preacher and began to organize a massive insurrection. The plan involved thousands of participants, dozens of coordinated attacks, and a grand vision of escape to Haiti. It was bold, carefully thought out, and inspiring. But once again, betrayal cracked the movement open before it could unfold. Vesey and many others were executed. And their story was buried deeper than the graves they were thrown into. But these men were not forgotten. Their names resurfaced generations later, reminding us that resistance never died, it just waited. One of the most important truths about these rebellions is that they were never simply about anger. They were about dignity, about reclaiming the right to breathe freely, speak freely, love freely, live freely. The right to not be property, but people. And even though many uprisings were crushed, the ideas they sparked spread far beyond the plantations where they began. These ideas helped shape abolitionist movements. They inspired free black communities in the North. They fueled debates that eventually split the nation. And they planted a truth that America could no longer ignore: a society built on chains is a society waiting to explode. When the Civil War finally erupted, many enslaved people didn't wait for freedom to reach them. They sought it out. They escaped to Union lines. They joined the fight. They became scouts, spies, soldiers, rescuers, and heroes. They fought in blue uniforms with a fire that came from generations of resistance. They weren't just fighting for a country, they were fighting for their ancestors and for generations yet to come. And when emancipation finally arrived, it didn't erase the past. It didn't erase the trauma, the scars, the families torn apart, the children sold, the languages lost, or the memories buried. But what it did do was confirm something the rebellions had been screaming all along: that enslaved people were not passive victims. They were agents of their own liberation. The story America often tells, the story of quiet suffering and patient endurance, is not the whole truth. The real story, the one pulsing beneath the official record, is a story of unstoppable human spirit. A story of rebellion that came not just through force, but through survival, intelligence, and community. And today, when we look back at these rebellions, Gabriel's courage, the Maroon's defiance, Charles Deslondes' organized march, Denmark Vesey's vision, we see something deeper than history. We see a legacy, a blueprint, a reminder that freedom isn't given, it's fought for. It's protected. It's earned through resilience that cannot be chained. America wasn't built by people who accepted oppression. It was built by people who challenged it, who risked everything for a chance at humanity, who believed in a future bigger than their circumstances. This is the story of America's secret slave rebellions. But they weren't secrets to the people who lived them. They were lifelines. They were declarations. They were proof that no system, not even the brutal machinery of slavery, could fully crush the human spirit. And as we tell their stories now, out loud, with pride and clarity, we honor them. We acknowledge them. And we continue the work they began, to pursue freedom, demand justice, and never, ever stay silent in the face of oppression. Because the greatest rebellion of all is remembering.